Hi out there in Guitar Moderne land. I once read a quote from Paul Klee. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. I took it to mean that a true artist made you see in a new way, one that hadn't occurred until you encountered their work. One aspect of David Toop's artistry lies in writing about music and sound in a way that changes the way you hear. It's not an exaggeration to say that reading his books Haunted Weather and Ocean of Sound changed my life. I lived in New York City at the time, and much of what I had heretofore heard as noise pollution became this symphony of sound. If you care about music beyond the narrowest band of commercial pop, his works are well worth reading. So I was chuffed, as they say on David's side of the pond, to be able to converse with him at length about music and sound. A lifelong guitarist, Toop's latest recording combines his love of twang, his encyclopedic knowledge of sound art, a term he might not care for, and a wanton disregard for genre. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with David Toop. And please subscribe to Guitar Moderne if you want to see more conversations like this. Actually, whether you subscribe or not, you will see there will be more conversations like this because I have a bunch in the can and they will be going up. Anyway, stay safe out there. Yeah, the last time I saw you was your 70th birthday party. The only time we've actually met was at Cafe Otto in
Right.
in happier days.
Yeah, absolutely. Cafe Otto was such a thriving place then. It's still going, but it's struggling.
I know I get their emails and I've tried to do some stuff to support them. I think I sent them money early on. Just yeah, I discovered them years ago when I was in London, and I don't know how I discovered them. I went down there and saw a great show, and it was just such a magical place. It just feels really good. The sound was really good,
Mm, mm.
and your show was a lot of fun as well. It was great to see you perform
Great, great.
and play guitar, which is what we're here to talk about.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'll ask you the usual first Guitar Moderne question, which is what kind of music did you first play when you could first play actual music on the guitar?
I I played the twangy guitar, the Shadows. Um, I started playing, I think, in about 1961, which was really around the peak of that style of music. So it was slightly pre-Beatles, and it was a kind of interim phase between rock and roll and bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Um, so the Shadows were pretty big then, and I love that sound, that twangy guitar sound. So the first tune I learned to play was Apache, and yeah, I still like that kind of sound. I think it probably comes across in everything I do, and even now that I still like that twangy guitar sound.
Well, we will talk about that because it's quite an evidence on the new record. But I was guitar your first instrument?
Yeah, yeah, guitar was my first instrument, and then later in my teens, I started to play flute, and then all the other things gradually accumulated. But in fact, I'd had a guitar for quite some years. I had an acoustic guitar, but um, my parents weren't musical people. They weren't artistic people. So I was kind of left to work it out for myself. And for a long time, it sort of went untouched. And then my sister um, developed a relationship with a man who became her husband and is now my brother-in-law. And he played guitar. And I guess that was an encouragement. And he had a Bo Diddley LP, which he gave to me. I don't think he liked it very much. It wasn't his style of music, and I absolutely loved it. It was around the same time that R&B music was starting to become fashionable in the UK, and I thought Bo Diddley's guitar playing was astonishing. So that was a big influence after the Shadows.
So did you play in kind of mainstream style, any mainstream style rock and roll bands early on?
I played in blues bands, R&B bands, yeah, school stuff, really. Nothing that ever got anywhere, but I was playing lead guitar in a couple of R&B bands. And I think the second one was more serious because I was already then getting a bit more scholarly, I was researching, I was beginning to, look into the history as much as it was possible at that time. And I was also becoming a bit of a record collector, in a very small way. So the songs I was hearing played by a lot of the white bands, UK white bands at the time, I was tracking down the originals and, listening to all of the different guitarists. Bo Diddley I've mentioned, but Buddy Guy was another big influence on me at that time. And so yeah, that was the basis of my style when I started getting serious.
It's interesting. I mean, reading your autobiography. I mean, we're almost exactly the same age, and grew up. And when we grew up, that was the thing. You would discover somebody like Jimi Hendrix or Cream, and then start looking backwards into the past and where they came from. And Buddy Guy was a huge influence on myself as well. And I got to see him play in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art once, which was amazing. And it's interesting. I just did a recent interview with Dave Tronzo. Do you know who he is? David Tronzo.
I don't know.
He's an amazing slide guitar player. He plays jazz and avant-garde music on the slide, but technically spectacular in terms of pitch, intonation, technique. But he teaches at Berkeley, and he was saying that his students, one thing about his students is they evidence very little curiosity. It is not in them, and I know you teach as well. I mean, so what is your experience with your students? Because his just would never think of delving in to find out where something came from.
Yeah, I do think it's a different impulse, and I think one thing you could say about that time, early 1960s, is that you really had to dig for information. And it was a kind of detective story in a way. The information was hard to come by. The records were hard to come by. You had to go to specialist shops. Of course, I didn't have very much money at all. So I could buy the occasional record. You had a few radio programs. There was a great blues show on pirate radio here in the early 1960s. But of course, that's very different. If you're listening to a radio show, then you're listening to what somebody has chosen to play you, and it's probably going to be an hour long or something. So, maybe you're making notes or whatever, but, it's here and it's gone. And that's very different to having a situation where you can go to YouTube or Spotify or podcasts or whatever, where almost everything is there for you if you want to find it. So I think that inculcates a very different attitude or a different approach. And I wouldn't say one is better than the other. It's just different eras, just different times. And in a way, you don't need the same curiosity if it's all there for you. It's like if you're a detective and all the clues are given to you on a piece of paper, then it's not going to encourage you to be Sherlock Holmes. And it's funny, I just this week started writing a new book, which is about Dr. John's Grigori album. And that was a record I first heard in 1968 when it first came out. And ever since then, you could say I've been trying to solve the mystery of that record, or the many mysteries associated with that record. And, it has been, I've described it in the book as being like a kind of Sherlock Holmes thing. So that approach is really embedded in me. It's the way I function. It's the way I get excited about things. If I sense a challenge in that way, that something is in some way mysterious, then I want to solve that problem. And I guess it applies to some of my favorite records, things like Smile by the Beach Boys, or There's a Riot Going On by Sly and the Family Stone. They're very mysterious records. A lot of stories about them, a lot of rumors about them, but you don't really know what was going on. So you want to, you want to solve those clues. And it's true, students of mine, I don't really teach anymore very much, but students of mine, they have a different kind of energy. They have different motivations, and it's just as good. It's all great, and they're wonderful. But no, I don't think they need that sense of deep curiosity in the same way.
That's interesting. So how did you get into non-mainstream music? The incredible wide range of music that you've written about and played and incorporated into your own music.
I guess the short answer to that is that I don't know. I think I responded to certain things. For example, that Bo Diddley LP, I responded to some of the sounds on there, which were very electronic and very experimental, particularly given the genre, which was kind of blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. I certainly responded to sound in a way that was quite marked. And of course, those things, who knows where they come from? Like I say, my parents weren't artistic people. They were very ordinary working people. And so there was nothing in my background that I could point to that led me in that direction. It was just I was excited about a lot of things, I would say, in my teens and even before. I was excited by writers, by artists, by musicians. I have no idea why. But with music, I suppose, the examples I've mentioned, say that twangy guitar music, there was something very atmospheric about it. And there was a focus on sound. So, if you listen to something like the John Barry 7, the James Bond theme, I interviewed John Barry about 5 times before he died. And, we talked a lot about this. And again, you had this sort of puzzle, what was going on in his music? Well, there were all kinds of things. He was listening to a lot of different types of music, and they became compressed into what he would laugh about it. He'd say, "Oh, twangy guitar music," which was the way he began. But I would say the same thing, that there were a lot of different things going on compressed into that music, even to the extent that you could say, well, the first tune I learned to play was Apache. Now, what was Apache about? Apache was coming off the back of a big craze of Westerns, which had been a huge thing in cinema for a number of decades. And by the time I was, coming up to the age of watching television, 8, 9, 10, there were a lot of Westerns showing, Western series. And I got very fascinated by Native American culture when I was a child. And then the same thing as researching blues or whatever, I was reading books on Native American culture when I was a teenager. So thinking about the music. So I think all of these things mixed together to create who I am.
Right. Well, you wrote. Sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say you wrote a book called Oceans of Sound that, I'm not ashamed to say changed my life, but in a sense that it made me realize. I mean, I don't know if changed my life is the word, but it made me realize that I had always been interested in the emotional content of sound. That for me, a lot of what makes the emotional content of music starts with the sound, and it kind of seems almost obvious to me that you start in the beginning was the tone, was the sound, and if that's not something that you like or moves you or you feel drawn to, then everything else, harmony, melody, rhythm, is kind of secondary. I know a lot of people don't feel that way, but definitely I've always felt that way. And the twang of the Shadows and that, and the Ventures over here, our version of the Shadows, that was the first guitar music that I got into because of the sound. Partly, it's just the way it sounds, and it's always been like that. The emotion, how do you feel about that? The connection of sound to the emotions.
I completely agree, and it's interesting. There are many people who hear music in a completely different way. I think, it's like two worlds. A lot of people listen to music; they're just listening to lyrics, or they're hearing the structure, or they're hearing a particular formal arrangement of whatever it is, pitches, or they're hearing the harmony or whatever, and they're listening for resolutions and all of this kind of thing. They're listening for progressions, but they're not primarily approaching it from the sound. And I agree with you. I think what captivated me was the sound, definitely. And connected with the sound, there were all kinds of things going on, like a sense of adventure, for example, a sense of freedom, a sense of creating imaginary worlds into which you could disappear. And that fits right in with an aspect of childhood, that imagination can take over and you can disappear into it. Well, you do that with games, or you do that with reading a book or whatever when you're a child. But if you also do it with music, because the sound seduces you, draws you in, then it's quite possible that that's going to be your life. That because it's a very powerful thing. I mean, that's one of the things I've been writing about, the way in which the recording studio became a place where kind of utopias could take place, like a political utopia, or the certain things could happen in respect of, say, for example, race, that couldn't happen in real life. Musicians of different color could come together and play, and Sly and the Family Stone is a great example. And that in life was very, very difficult. So, listening to music and more or less disappearing into the sound of it opened up so many possibilities, I think, of thought and your emotional life and just the way you engage with the world. So I think that was definitely a very powerful factor for me. I became obsessed with music. And, to go back to your question of the non-mainstream, I suppose, once you're listening to the sound, as opposed to thinking, I like this kind of genre or I like this kind of song, then it's quite easy for you to, you hear a bit of electronic music or some free improvisation or some free jazz or whatever, and it's exciting. Yeah, it's taking you a little bit further down this particular path that you've already started on because of, hearing a twangy guitar. And in a way, it's not so different. And I think the thing with Ocean of Sound was that it was me saying, these things are not so different. And a lot of people say that book changed their life, which is, of course, very flattering and very gratifying. I mean, somebody just emailed me today and said it. I think it's about making that move, which is not a big move, but it's, moving away from thinking about genres, kind of neat divisions between types of music, which of course represent all kinds of things. They represent the marketing of music, and they represent the racial divisions and cultural divisions, and so on and so on. But if you say, okay, well, let's step beyond this genre listening and move into sound, and suddenly, the world is open.
Well, exactly. I mean, I after reading that book, noises that would have annoyed me before just became part of a musical landscape. Things. I mean, I was living in New York at the time, so noise was everywhere. But even things like people talking during concerts, it just kind of became, it's part of the musical landscape. It all, if you don't resist it and you just go with it, there's that kind of thing. It's also, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you found this, but part of what's been heartening in terms of founding this magazine is how genres have fallen apart. I mean, how since, I've been going now for, 10 years with it or something. And it was heartening at the beginning to see how many people were interested, but over the last 10 years, how many people are, musicians, but obviously they have audiences as well, are willing to accept the lack of genre. I mean, I always found the Scandinavian scene to be kind of a stronghold of that for decades, where, they just didn't seem to care whether they were playing pop music, jazz, avant-garde, and all at once on some of those records. There was no, we can't play melody because we're playing avant-garde music, or we can't play avant-garde music because we're playing stuff that's melodic. I mean, just going back to early Harold Anderson records and Nils Petter Molvar and all those people, which was part of, my education in this world. But I also want to find out, when did you start playing non-mainstream music, actually getting involved with people who were exploring the kind of ideas that you had been working with?
I think the breakthrough I had as a player was in the first band I was in, and that was an R&B band, that was playing similar kind of material to the first Rolling Stones album. A couple of more obscure things I discovered, and I wouldn't say we were really friends. It was just who's there who can play a little bit. And so, you know, it was one of those bands, there were a lot of tensions. And I remember we had a rehearsal one evening and I was playing Bottleneck and I just sort of let go of the underpinning and, you know, it took me where it took me. And the rest of the band were just horrified. They thought I'd lost my mind. And it was a revelation. I think, you know, because it comes in that situation, which is more charged in a way. You know, you're not just at home on your own trying to do something like that. It's not exactly public, but, you know, it's a band of people trying to hold things together, and suddenly one member goes crazy, and the other three, who are far more conservative, are just they're not happy at all. And I guess, you know, it gradually developed from there, you know, being at home, starting to hear more and more adventurous things, new things, partly on the radio, of course, but also going to gigs and being surprised by things. You know, I often talk about this experience in 1966 of hearing AMM by accident when I went to hear Cream play and being really shocked. And, you know, I couldn't figure out what was going on.
Who was in it at that time?
It was the first group, so Eddie Prevost, Lou Gare, Cornelius Cardew, Christopher Hobbs, Keith Rowe was the band. And it was, well, I mean, it's one of those experiences where you don't think about it too much at the time, but it resonates through the years and becomes bigger and bigger, I suppose. And because the memory is such a fragment, then you tend to embellish it just to make a story out of it. So I've told that story many times, and it'd be kind of interesting to go back there and experience what actually did happen. But I know it had a big effect on me, and it affected my playing. So my playing became more exploratory. And I suppose I went to art school, and I suppose what happened then was that I came into contact with far more people who were interested in experimentation of different kinds. But it took me a long time to find a real kind of partner to work with, and that happened in 1969. I was taking part in jam sessions. I was working at the Roundhouse, which is, you know, a famous London venue where I had actually seen this concert by Cream and AMM a few years earlier. I was working there, and there were jam sessions at night, and this drummer showed up, and gradually we developed a friendship and a working relationship which lasted for many years, and that was a guy called Paul Burwell. And, you know, we were trying to play a sort of free rock music, and everybody who joined with us would leave almost before they joined. You know, it was just you know, people were like, why won't you play normal stuff? And I guess we were both very intense young men, and we were both quite driven in a similar way. And, you know, I guess if we had been the right kind of players, and if we had been playing a different kind of music, we could have gone quite a long way, because we were ambitious. But, you know, we had this handicap, I suppose, of being drawn into music which, although it had the in a way, it had the sound of electric rock music. It was really quite formless, relatively speaking. It was, finding its way. And I was playing flute at the time as well. And, we were both listening to a lot of free jazz, some of the early free improvisation things like SME and Derek Bailey and Ham Bennett. We were both huge Sun Ra fans. We both went to see Sun Ra and the orchestra when they played in London in 1971, I think it was. That was a kind of pilgrimage for us. We were listening to traditional musics and, Scottish pibroch, bagpipe music, and all of these different things, and bird song and animal sounds. By that point, both in our early 20s, we were just absorbing everything we could find. And the only place for us to go was the free improvisation scene. There was nowhere else we could go. And so we started attending the workshops given by John Stevens, the SME drummer. And, that helped us both a lot, I think, with our approach to that kind of playing. So, by that time I was really experimenting with the guitar because I was frustrated with it. It's all very well growing up playing twangy guitar and 12-bar blues, but it doesn't give you much vocabulary to develop. And I was practicing hard then, but I'd never been taught. I was self-taught. So I was practicing hard, but probably in the wrong way. Well, certainly in the wrong way. So I started thinking about the sound of the guitar. And I was hearing things like John Cage's music for prepared piano. And also I was hearing Balinese and Javanese gamelan. And I don't really know how it came about. I think it was from probably learning about Cage and the way he prepared the piano, the way he was using nuts and bolts and rulers and this kind of thing. And obviously the piano lends itself to that kind of preparation, but the guitar doesn't. And so I started experimenting with what we call crocodile clips. I think they're alligator clips in the US.
Right.
Attaching them to the strings, and I found that it created this very interesting sound, like a kind of gong sound. Keith Rowe had done it before me, but I didn't know that because AMM always played in darkness, so you couldn't see what they were doing. I used to go and see them a lot, but they were always playing in darkness. So you didn't know exactly, I didn't know how he was getting the sounds he was getting.
That seems to have continued to this day, by the way. When you look at
totally.
When you look at videos of avant-garde improvisers, they're always playing in the dark. But was it a thing where you recognized the sound? I mean, you heard the sound, so when you put the alligator clips on, you recognized it as kind of what he had been doing?
No, not at all, because AMM at that point, it was really a kind of almost a homogeneous noise.
Right.
Okay. It was a very solid kind of wall of noise. And so, you could differentiate things within it, like a cello or a particular kind of drum or a saxophone sound, but it was very immersive, and it wasn't really possible to pick out something like that. And anyway, I don't think I would have known what it was. So No, I related it very much to things like the cage and the um,
Gamelan.
gamelan, but also to methods of distortion used in African music. So you know the kind of buzzing sounds that
Right.
using buzzing materials like spiders' egg sac cases on resonators for xylophones, that kind of sound, or using bottle tops on a thumb piano. I was listening to that kind of thing a lot as well. So that was what I was relating to. And of course, the prepared guitar was a bit like the darkness. You know, it became a thing that to this day, you know, now you can see YouTube videos of guitarists telling you how to, you know, get strange sounds on your guitar. So we come back to that curiosity thing. You know, you don't need the curiosity because there's a guy telling you what to do. But yeah, it became a thing, but it didn't become a thing through me. It became a thing through Fred Frith.
Right.
Fred saw me do it. You know, that myself and Paul, we called ourselves Rain in the Face, which again was this Native American influence, because Rain in the Face was a Lakota chief. And we were invited by Chris Cutler to play with Henry Cow on one of their evenings. And Fred saw me doing this thing with the crocodile clips, and he started doing it. And then his first solo album, there was a photo which clearly showed the preparation on his guitar with the crocodile clips. And then that unleashed a wave of prepared guitarists, which continues, you know, to this day.
I know. I know. I always find that amazing. I mean, I have a magazine called Guitar Moderne, and you know, write about avant-garde guitar, and you know, then you see all these avant-garde guitarists using essentially techniques that are now what 50 years old or
50 years old, yes.
yeah, or,
that's right.
you know, so it's
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it's one thing for me that's moved me towards more electronics, using more electronics with the instrument, which brings me to my next question. Do you find anything special or particular about the guitar as a sound generating instrument, you know, as opposed to any other way of generating sound?
Well, I suppose partly it's what I know, and it's an instrument I play every day. I have two guitars. One's my Telecaster, and the other is a nylon string guitar. And the nylon string guitar, I sort of neglected, abandoned almost. And then in recent months, I've been playing it every day and trying to work out a way of playing it, you know, that's personal to myself. I'm not saying it's radically different or anything, you know, but I'm not using any preparations, any of these avant-garde techniques. I'm just using a different tuning and working on tone, which was something you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. And, you know, just trying to find something that is satisfying to me. But I do find, I find guitar still has a lot of potential. And although I work with many different tools, materials, including electronics, there's something about guitar that I still find very appealing. And I still find things that I feel are new to me, at least. Maybe not to anybody else, but, you know. It's also a question of how you use these things. So they may not be particularly original in sound, but then the context you use them in, you know, the piece you use them in can make them work in a different way. I think that's one of the things I was trying to do on the new album.
Perfect segue, because I wanted to ask you, about the new album. First of all, what was the process of putting it together? I mean, what did you start with? Like, or did it vary from piece to piece, or would you lay down one sound and then, excuse me, add other sounds? And I mean, obviously, it was mostly you doing it solo. So it was. So how did you piece it together?
It's funny when I did my last solo album, which was also for Lawrence English for Room 40. I thought, this is probably my last album. I don't think I have any more ideas. Which is a bit, there's a lot of pathos if I say it in that way, but it didn't feel like that at the time. I felt very satisfied, very happy with the album. And I thought, yeah, if I can make an album like that in my late 60s and I feel good about it, then okay, if I'm done, I'm done. But then Lawrence said to me, how about another album? This was a few years later. And I thought, well, I don't really have any ideas. I'm working away on improvisations and I was enjoying that. But in terms of making an album in that way, I really wasn't sure. But then I started to, if I was watching a movie, I would notice something said in the dialogue. Or if I was reading a book, I would notice something within the story. And I was writing those things down. Like Douglas Sirk movies or something. Often very kind of romantic material. And I was just thinking, this could be something. And then April, March, April, I guess. I can't remember the first thing I did, but I thought, okay, now I've started making a new album. And then the process to me is I often have many files, audio files, things I haven't used, or things I started and abandoned, or just sketches for things, or things I've made for live things, and things I've made for live performances. Never use them in a piece. It's a question of bringing those all together into a folder. And once you start working with the materials, that's the important thing to me. That you start something and then it leads on to other things. I mean, that's the same as anything else I do. I just started a book. Well, I've been researching this book for over 2 years and frightened to start it because I had too much research, too many ideas. And then one day you just sit down and it begins. And it's like a miracle. It's like, what changed?
Well, it's the big first step. That I think it's the first step. That's
it's a huge thing. It's one of the things that we're not really taught. I think you have to find your own way to that. How to make that first step, and then once you made that first step and the process is underway and you're captivated by it, then it starts to get a shape, a feel, and you start to understand a little bit about what's going on, and pieces come along, and I had certain people I wanted to work with, and so I was approaching that in different ways. One person, Keiko Yamamoto, who co-runs Cafe Otto. She's in a group called Oyama-O with a very good friend of mine, Rie Nakajima. And I love that group. And I love Keiko's songs. And I'd worked with her on a few occasions with these songs. And I thought, I would love to have these songs. They're like very simple, very moving lullabies, and they had a particular atmosphere to them, a particular kind of emotional resonance that I really, really loved. And I thought I would like to work with two of those songs. So she just recorded, sitting outside late at night with a Zoom recorder. She recorded a couple of songs, and I just built up stuff around them. So yeah, that was more or less the way it worked. To me, it's very intuitive. I don't have any method particularly. It's very responsive to the way something is developing, which is no different from writing a book or painting or anything like that. It's a very organic growth, I think. And, to a certain extent, you're allowing the materials to grow themselves.
Right. Well, and as we've discussed, the first step is really important. I'm always curious about the last step, which is how do you know when it's done?
I think vinyl has a big voice in this.
Who does?
Vinyl.
Oh, vinyl. Oh, that's interesting.
Making vinyl LPs. Because you're suddenly back to the situation where you've got like 20 minutes aside. Otherwise, it can't be cut. And so that makes you more strict about how much material you use and how long things can be. And I think one of the other things I felt was I didn't want to do one of these long form things. I like the idea of 2-minute tracks, 3-minute tracks. It's sort of the opposite of what I would do if I was playing in, improvisation.
Right.
Where you play for like 30 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever, and it's continuous. So I like the idea of these very short tracks, and sometimes the shorter the better. So then it becomes like almost like you've made a pop album. And you're thinking, where does this go? How does this work? Is this a good order? How many tracks have I got? Does it come to less than 20 minutes? And then I have another 20 minutes to think about. It's a lot of the things I do are very practical in that way. They're quite pragmatic.
Right.
They're not governed by divine intervention or anything like that. They're really kind of quite straightforward. And as for when a track is done, I think, again, that's a very intuitive process, and it's very personal as well. Another person might say, well, there's way too much stuff in this, and somebody else would say, this is nowhere near finished, this is a mess. But if it feels right to you, then that's what you're presenting. And I try not to be a perfectionist. I try not to worry too much about an abstract idea of completion. It's just when it feels right to me, and very often I'll strip back as much as I can, get rid of as much as I can, so I feel that what's there has to be there. And if it's still there, then if I take it away, then there'll be something missing. So I mean, that's so easy to do now, working in the computer. You just mute something. Does it still work? Okay, if it's still good, then we don't need it. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's true. I mean, it is easy to do in music, and my wife is a collage artist, and she's always going through. Well, does it need something more? And she'll show it to me. Do you think it's finished, or is it finished? And at some point, she has to decide. Sometimes I think it's finished, and I'll go, maybe, and then she'll go back and add something, and it'll be better. And yeah, and in some sense, it's not just abstract; it's arbitrary. I mean, it could be, one way of doing it could be good, and another way could be some just as good, but something else. It becomes something else, I guess, is the way it works. But speaking of collage, I mean, it seems like this kind of recording really has a collage aspect to it or painting, just having a palette of sounds and adding things to it. I was curious, how much of a performative aspect do you think this kind of recording has? Is the performance in just each part that you perform? Is there a performative aspect in the mix of it as well?
I think there's less of a performative aspect in the mix of it, because the mix, when you're mixing in an application like Logic, it's very calculated. It's not like the old days of working in a 24-track studio and a desk, with faders, which I used to do, working on my own music and other people's music. That hands-on feeling is not really there. Although you can recapture it to some extent using MIDI controller for certain things, and I sometimes do that, but there's definitely a performative aspect to certain of the tracks. And when I say tracks, I mean tracks within tracks.
Right.
They have to be played in a certain way to be convincing or to really work. And that's obviously true of guitar parts. There are a number of different types of guitar part on this album. There's nylon string guitar, there's very heavily distorted guitar, there's straight electric guitar, and all of them demanded performances. But I would say some of the other, the much less conventional ways of making sounds, so for instance, working with bone conduction loudspeakers on metal surfaces, that also demands a kind of performance. And so there's a direct connection between improvised music performance in front of an audience and what I would do here, on my desk at home. There's a different feeling to it, but it still demands a certain kind of performative aspect. Yeah, so, for sure.
Would you, was there a fair amount of you creating sounds specifically to go with other sounds that you already had on the recording, or were you pulling from files that you had already performed of those particular sounds?
Both methods, definitely both methods. I mean, sometimes I'll just spend an afternoon experimenting with something and build up a whole bunch of files, and then I don't know what I'm going to do with them. They can sit there for a year, or 2 years. And then I'll also just sit here, in the morning and record 10 guitar tracks. For example, at one point I was thinking I wanted a particular kind of guitar. So I was actually thinking about Bo Diddley, funnily enough, and I was thinking about a track he did called Detour, which is a fairly obscure instrumental, which I kind of like, and I like playing it. But, playing that with a lot of vibrato and a lot of reverb and so on, and trying different things, and then one thing leads on to the next thing I'm using certain distortion pedals. Like I have this antique distortion pedal, which I've been using for 50 years, called the Wem Rush Pet Box.
Wow.
Which is kind of a secret weapon. Very extreme distortion, which you hear at the beginning of one of the songs by Keiko Yamamoto. This kind of thunderous, distorted guitar. So, I can build up 10 tracks in that way very quickly, and then figure out whether I want to use them or not, or how to use them. But then also, I did this track called All I Desire, which is like a pop track. And it's funny, there have been 2 reviews one of them, or 2 reviews made reference to the Cocteau Twins, which was the last thing in my mind. And somebody else mentioned chillwave stuff, this guy, Toru Imoi, who I kind of like. I have a couple of his tracks, but I can't say I've ever listened to seriously. But actually, my reference point for that track was the Beach Boys.
Really?
The 2 instrumentals on Pet Sounds, particularly Let's Go Away for a While, which is always, that track has always fascinated me, partly because it's a tune that has a melody that you can't really sing. I mean, Brian Wilson said at some point he defied somebody to be able to sing that melody, and it's partly because the melody isn't really stated. It's just there in the chords. And every section has a different kind of instrumentation. You've got vibraphones in one section and vibraphone in one section, and then you've got reeds in another section. And, the way he had this modular way of thinking about production and arrangement. So, he could hear a whole arrangement in his head that was actually very complex. And then the Wrecking Crew people would play it. I mean, I couldn't do that because, I'm not Brian Wilson for one thing, but I couldn't do it because I can't, unless I go into a studio and bring in many, many people, I can't get a vibraphone player and a accordion player. So I made this tune, which was mostly guitars. And, then of course you've got to perform. You can't play it one note at a time. You've got to play it properly.
Right.
And it's interesting. I've read 2 reviews which have kind of doubted whether I'm actually playing guitars. I don't know whether
I couldn't even get my head around that because listening to the record, no. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's more guitar on this record than any other record you've ever made.
Totally, yeah, totally. And I can't get my head around it either, but it's either because people assume that I can't really play the guitar, so it must be something else, or they've lost all confidence in being able to recognize whether an instrument is an instrument, which would be understandable, I guess, because so many things can be manufactured one way or another these days.
But that spaghetti Western sound throughout, you could touch him, but he wasn't there. I mean, what else could that be? That's, exactly. I mean, if they've never listened to spaghetti Westerns or anything, they've heard James Bond themes. They know what that sound is. I can't believe it. But what were you using on that tune in particular? Was that your telly? Because I hear some almost whammy bar stuff somewhere.
Yeah, it's a telly with a Bixby whammy.
Oh, it's got the Bixby on it. Okay.
Yeah, it's got a Bixby. So yeah, I mean, I could never play an electric guitar without we call it a tremolo arm. Right. And it's an instrument of. It's a thing of great potential, I think. I mean, if I watch somebody like Jeff Beck playing, who I love his playing, and, what he does with his little finger and the whammy bar is extraordinary. So, but I've always loved that sound, of course.
Well, the great thing about the Bigsby is it allows you to play behind the bridge also and get those sounds and and yeah, of course, there's all that kind of stuff. There's a vocal like sound in Tiny Human Figurines that sounds almost like it sounds like someone's crying or speaking. I was wondering if that is guitar because there are places where you don't know for sure. I mean, it sounds like a guitar through some sort of distortion in a wah pedal. Is that what it is, or is that something else entirely?
No, it's the lap steel with a false bridge and an ebow.
Oh, okay.
So the bridge in the middle means I can bend the strings enormously. So it
Like a
becomes,
coda. You
yeah, it becomes that's exactly right. It becomes more like a Korean or a Japanese stringed instrument of that type. But using the ebow means I can get that crying sound. It's just something I discovered years ago, and I've used it a lot on my records since the 90s. And I'm kind of surprised nobody else uses it. But then I did this duo with Ryuichi Sakamoto a couple of years back in London, and Ryuichi had started playing guitar as well as all the other things he plays, and he was doing it too. So, and in fact, that concert is being released sometime early next year, and there's a section where we're both doing it, and it's kind of craziness. Yeah, but that's what that sound is on that track.
Oh, that's interesting. What were you recording the guitar through an amp? And were you using the tremolo and the reverb from the amp, or were you going direct and using some other kind of effect?
I tend to use an amp, but then I can DI the amp into the mixer because I can't really make noise here where I live. So, I have to be restrained in terms of what noise I can make. Ideally, I would just play through the amp in a studio, but that's the closest that I can get to the amp sound. And usually I'm adding reverb afterwards because I'm extremely fussy about reverb sounds, I suppose. So I like to have a lot of choice and to try things out.
What reverb are you using? Is it a plug-in?
Plugins, yeah, plugins, yeah. Reverbs in Logic, and I experiment a lot with reverbs because, I think that's one of the things, going back to your point about sound, and there's a particular tradition there, you might say, which is kind of a Phil Spector tradition. And I think one of my fascinations with the Grigori album is because it was recorded at Gold Star in Los Angeles, and it was produced and arranged by Harold Batiste, who had been working with Sonny and Cher, who were,
Right, working with Phil Spector.
disciples of Phil Spector. And so, that sense that there's something in the shadows of the reverb that you can't quite figure out what it is, which is very typical of that tradition and really the basis of it. That there's so much going on, you don't know what it is. So it becomes mysterious in a way. I still love that. And I think it's very, very important when we're working digitally, because digital recordings can lose all mystery. You can have so much clarity that there's no puzzle to it. There's nothing left to wonder about. It's all just there. So in that sense, I use, there are certain things where you can barely hear whatever sound it might be. Maybe it's a guitar that's, it's so low in the mix that you can barely hear it, and the reverb. So that kind of thing is crucial, so you're not drowning in reverb. But it's in there if you're a close listener, or a headphone listener.
Yeah. Well, the thing about reverb, I mean, you're absolutely right. It adds this kind of mystery. I mean, the tradition, it goes back. I read this academic book about reverb once, or tried to read it. It was so dry, it was virtually unreadable. But what I
That's
did,
what you mean.
but what I did glean from it was he talks about how churches were built specifically to create a certain kind of reverb that gave the priesthood this this authority, this that made their voices sound booming and resonant, and gave them a kind of authority that they wouldn't have necessarily in a dry space. And so I've always been fascinated with reverb as well, and the it is there isn't just reverb and not reverb. There are so many types in the way you use them, and what they can create. Is that acoustic guitar on smaller Life Spirits? Is that the nylon you were talking about?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was beginning to play it again, and um, at that time I was playing in conventional tuning. But actually, there was a funny thing that happened. I recorded a couple of pieces on nylon string guitar, and one of them I decided to use for one of the songs by Keiko, and they're in completely different keys. And I think I've listened to so much non-standard tuning music in my life, and not just music, but sound, without getting into that debate, but you know what I mean,
Right.
listening to things that are not well tempered. And so these things don't bother me. But then I mix everything on headphones here because of the the limitations I have, and then I decided to take everything into the studio. The guy I've worked with since late 70s, Dave Hunt, and just to check my mixes, because it's a kind of dangerous thing to mix on headphones. Right. And I also invited in one of the singers, an ex-student of mine called Ifat Ziv, who's an amazing Israeli singer, just to do her part. And she was listening to the mixes through with me, and both her and Dave said, that guitar part really bothers us, both of them, it really disturbed them. And I thought, okay, I compromise sometimes, I'm not going to be completely uncompromising in everything. I'll take it out, because if it bothers them, two people with very, very good ears, then it's going to bother so many people that it's going to become too important. So that's when I approached Anya O'Dwyer, and said, would you play some harp? And she played this, kind of metal string harp, which is really, I think, amazing. It's very, it's quite aggressive playing in a way. It's the opposite of concert harp. So I was kind of happy about that. I was sort of allowing other people's opinions to guide me for a change.
Well, the people whose opinions, these are people whose opinions you respect, and are obviously not people who, think the ultimate avant-garde is, Radiohead or something. I mean,
Yeah.
It is, I guess it's worth taking into consideration. Getting back to All I Desire for a minute, it's fun. It was interesting to hear you say that it was influenced by the Beach Boys. What I heard, first of all, the surprise of it appearing in the midst of all this other music. After I got over that, then I said, well, what it kind of reminds me of is the kind of pop music, instrumental pop music you might hear in an Asian restaurant,
Mm-hmm.
where then I thought that made more sense because I know, you've worked a lot in Japan and you are into, I mean, I guess the Exotica book delved somewhat into that. And so I got a little bit of that. Was that in there at all, or is that just my take on it?
Oh, I think it's very possible. Yeah, I actually really like. I mean, I've traveled in Asia a lot. You know, China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Japan, Korea, etc., etc. And yeah, you do hear that kind of music. You're absolutely right, and I love it. It's very often it's music that you're never going to hear it ever again, and you don't know what it is. There's no way to identify it. It's just something that it's a fleeting moment in your life, and it's very evocative in some way. It's very um, it kind of captures that feeling of that moment somehow, and I love that about music. So I'm sure, yes, there was a sense of I was looking for something that existed outside time in a way. And I think you can often feel that about that type of music. You can't pin it down to a particular genre or a particular era or a particular fashion or whatever. It's floating in the ether somewhere. And, I agonized about that track. Should I include it or should I just finish it and throw it away? And I think it's something to do with getting older, and being not really caring so much about whether something should be there or shouldn't be there. These kind of strange, it's like the voice on your shoulder that's saying, no, you really shouldn't be doing that, And I think once you pass 70, then to hell with it, really.
I think the less
And
elegant term is "fresh out of fucks," as people put it. But in addition to that, there's a couple of things. One, when I first started getting into electronic music, somebody recommended Telephone Tel Aviv, and I don't know if you ever heard that band, but the album that they recommended and that I listened to was all over the place in terms of, there'd be a dance track, there'd be a kind of avant-garde track, there'd be a poppy track. And I was thinking, coming out of the world of pop music and, the era that I came out of, it was like, no, everything's got to be, the same because people are listening to this all the way through and they want to get a feeling for the whole thing. But the second thing is that do people listen to things all the way through anymore? And as it's become, if something's going to show up on shuffle play, who cares what it is? It doesn't have to go with the track before. It doesn't have to go with the track after anymore. So, while that did jar me in the context of this particular record to a certain extent, in the larger scheme of things, it's like, yeah, why not? The other thing is that kind of music to me, it's what I call dislocation music. It's the way I feel about John Hassel's music. It's like, in this era when somebody calls you on their cell phone and you have no idea where they are because their area code has nothing to do with where they live anymore. And it's that William Gibson thing, that his last four novels have been dealing with, which is this kind of international dislocation and cultural dislocation that, which part of me loves. I just love that. I love the fact. So music like that becomes kind of a soundtrack for the world I want to live in, one in which it doesn't place you in a specific era or a specific place or a specific genre.
well, I think the pandemic in a way has emphasized that, reinforced that, because everything is happening on Zoom or Skype or whatever. I've I've examined a couple of PhDs in the summer, and one of them was a guy in Japan. He was in Tokyo. The other examiners were in the north of England, and I was here at my desk at 9 o'clock in the morning. And it's kind of weird and it isn't weird. It's sometimes it's technically challenging, but in another sense, we accept it. And over the last 7 months, we've grown to accept it more because we've had to. And I think there are, musically speaking, there are a number of precedents for that. One of them is obviously soundtrack albums, which I listen to a lot. And I wrote sleeve notes for an album of the soundtrack to The Friends of Eddie Coyle by Dave Grusin. I don't know if you know that film.
Yeah.
Robert Mitchum is in it. It's a great score, a really kind of cool, funky, jazz fusiony score, but inevitably with that kind of soundtrack, you get great tunes and then you just get atmospheres. And I always loved that. It's the same with Morricone albums. Morricone was so extraordinarily diverse. So, you get one of the spaghetti westerns and you get the most experimental music because he was playing in an free improvisation group at the same time he was making that music. But then you've also got the big tunes, the big tunes with the strings, and you've got the twangy guitar tunes, and it's all one thing. And I'm sure I've been affected by that, but maybe inhibited in certain respects in the past. Well, actually, maybe not, because I think I've always included, these anomalous tracks in albums I've done. It's just this one is really like it's a kind of extra, that sort of feeling.
It's extra outlying. Because
outlying, yeah.
There isn't another one, or the rest of it hangs together. So, so specifically, that's the main reason. Speaking of the pandemic, how are you doing during it, and how's London doing at this point?
I'm doing fine. In many ways, although, I've had anxieties and same worries as everybody else, or when I say everybody else, I should say everybody else who is kind of sensible and sane.
Yeah.
But I've really enjoyed it in many respects because I think it's taken away that desperate busyness and activity and the pressure of normal life. And I don't know how much I can take that anyway, constantly doing so many different things and traveling all the time. So in a way it came at a moment when I was really ready for it. I'd been thinking at the beginning of this year, I must change my life in some way, because I can't carry on like this. It's crazy. And so the decision was made for me, and I had to adapt the way we've all had to adapt in our different ways. Everybody has a different story. I missed playing gigs, but then, I had a long time when I didn't play gigs in the 80s and early 90s, when I was working as a music writer. So from about 1985 or 6 until maybe 1994, I didn't play any gigs. So, that's not so new for me. And I got a lot of commissions to write, which was kind of funny because I decided at the beginning of the year that I didn't want to write anymore. I was sick of it. And I've been writing nonstop since March. I don't know. I have, my daughter and her partner and my granddaughter. I've seen them, and I've seen a few friends at a distance and kept in touch with everybody. I've done a lot of reading. I've done a lot of painting. I've done a lot of playing. Yeah, it's been very productive for me.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, David. I'm expecting delivery of your latest book of older writings, the compilation, tomorrow. So
Oh, great.
I'm looking forward to that. And it's a pleasure to get to talk to you after all I've gleaned from your writings. And I hope you can stay healthy and safe. And I know you said you didn't have another record in you, but here we are. And so who knows? Well, and I can't wait to read the Dr. John book when that comes out.
Yeah, I'm going to try and work on that until Christmas at least. I mean, strangely enough, all the other work just disappeared. I think it was because a lot of people had money to do events and the events were cancelled, so they put the money into other things, like commissioning writing, and that phase has come to an end, and which is kind of more worrying for them than it is for me, because I'm kind of okay. I'll survive financially, but that emptying out of things is basically saying to me, okay, write this book. And so hopefully I can get quite a bit of it done before Christmas, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you as well. And, likewise, stay safe. And I hope you survive your forthcoming election.